War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 63, the Battle of Metaurus. Okay, here we go. Rome. Well, Rome and Carthage. So Rome and Carthage battled for control of the Mediterranean basin and the surrounding countries over more than a century in three separate campaigns known in the modern era as the Punic Wars. The term Punic refers to the Greek word for the Phoenicians, as the Carthaginians were known, which portrays an unquestioned Greek and, by extension, Roman history of the conflicts. There are no known Carthaginian accounts of the war. All that we know came from Roman sources, so I can't vouch for the accuracy of their versions, merely that I attempt to consolidate the lessons learned accordingly. The city of Carthage was located in what is today Tunisia, and specifically near Tunis. Note, Tunisia is one of the few countries in North Africa that really correlates to the city-states earlier. It's far smaller than its neighbors like Libya and Algeria. Neither Rome nor Carthage would identify the conflict by the Greek Punic descriptor, yet here we are. The Phoenicians were a prehistoric people who self-identified by the biblically familiar term Canaanites. Not a unified nation, they, like the Greeks, were a disjointed set of city-states, primarily along the coast of today's Lebanon. The term Phoenician comes from the Egyptian meaning carpenter, as the cedars of Lebanon were one of the major export items. Likewise, the Phoenicians were primarily seafaring traders, providing Persia its sailors and boats during its wars with Greece. While the Canaanites' archaeological history dates back over 5,000 years, their establishment of a colony in Carthage is recorded around 900 BC. Primarily a peaceful trading culture, the Carthaginians challenged the Greek colonies on Sicily, located just north of Carthage. Having seized that, they expanded into the Iberian Peninsula, and then sought to expand into Italy during the Republic era and bringing them into conflict with the Romans. The First Punic War was a brutal affair ostensibly over control of Sicily, but in reality was the challenging of the two great empires of the Mediterranean, with the waning Hellenic empires of the East slowly dissolving. The war ended with both sides exhausted, but the Romans controlling Sicily and, after several victories at sea, the Mediterranean as well. The Carthaginians were forced to agree to an expensive peace with stiff reparations that were effectively unpayable after 20 years of near constant conflict. This peace lasted for 23 years, during which time the Carthaginians were racked by revolts in their remaining colonies. The Carthaginians were sailors, and nearly all their land forces were comprised of mercenaries. These mercenaries demanded payment at the conclusion of the First Punic War, which Carthage was incapable of paying. Eventually, the mercenary revolt was put down, but the raising of a new army was considered a threat by Rome, who demanded additional payments and the surrender of the Carthaginian colony on Sardinia. Carthage expanded into Iberia, which gave them access to silver and other goods, which gave the state newfound power. Rome concluded a treaty with Carthage delineating the limits of the expanding empire. Rome ended up supporting the revolt of a city within the Carthaginian sphere and used this as a pretext to war. The Carthaginians, based out of the capital in Iberia, New Carthage, now known as Cartagena, were initially very successful, as led by the famous Hannibal. Time and again, Romans were defeated by his maneuvers through the mountains of northern Italy and through what is now southern France, then known as Gaul. Distressed by the events, the Romans appointed Fabius Maximus, who utilized the now famous Fabian strategy of avoiding large conflicts and trying to harass and slowly attrit the Carthaginians as they rampaged through northern Italy on their march south, much to the consternation of the Roman Senate, who appointed him. By this time, Hannibal had marched to the south of Rome while never attempting a direct attack. Frustrated by Fabius's failure to confront and defeat Hannibal, in 2016 they appointed two new consuls to lead an army, which eventually led to the famous Battle of Cannae, where the Romans were utterly massacred, losing over 60,000 soldiers. This is considered the greatest defeat the Romans suffered. They soon lost another 25,000 in a separate battle with the Gauls. Fabius was soon reappointed dictator. The war raged as cities were taken, garrisoned, and then retaken when the conquering army moved on. The logistics of the era simply could not support a static army. It was these lessons that drove the Romans of the Empire era to develop the roads and magnificently disciplined logistics that allowed the Republic to become an empire. The bulk of the fighting now was in southern Italy and was exhaustive and inconclusive. The Romans had shorter lines of supply, and the Carthaginians were hampered by continued Roman control of Sicily, which interdicted the Carthaginian sea lines of communications. Carthaginian attempts to retake Sicily ultimately failed. Hannibal was successful in southern Italy, but could not conclude the war. His younger brother, Hasdrubal Barca, led a force of 35,000 in 207 BC across the Alps to the north, hoping to unite with his brother and provide enough force to finally defeat the Romans and claim the Mediterranean for Carthage forever. With two large Carthaginian armies, both led by sons of the famous Hamilcar Barca, the Romans sent two armies to deal with them, led by Claudius Nero, who was sent south to contend with Hannibal, and Marcus Livius north to face Hasdrubal Barca. Both Romans avoided direct conflict with the Carthaginians, but presented large enough forces, nearly 40,000 for each of their armies, such that the Carthaginians had to contend with the threat, freezing them out of offensive actions. This period of tense inactivity was broken when messengers sent from Hasdrubal to his brother were intercepted and a planned meetup between the two armies was soon planned. The threat of the combined armies was enough to demand decisive action on the part of the Romans. Claudius Nero, in the south, took a select army of 8,000 north, taking only weapons and raising additional levies en route, while feeding his army from villages along the way. He did this of his own accord and without notifying the Roman Senate beforehand. This was audacious and risky. The forces left behind, while still strong, were absent their best soldiers and their general. Had Hannibal detected this departure, a swift attack and march upon Rome would have been catastrophic. But after years of fighting, I suspect Hannibal's brilliant mind was dulled a bit, and he missed the key opportunity. Also, he was largely unaware of his brother's whereabouts because, as noted, the messengers were intercepted. Regardless, the departure of Nero was missed, or at best not recognized for the threat and opportunity it presented. The combined forces drew up against Hasdrubal, who likewise arranged his forces and prepared for battle, but he quickly saw the increased number of Romans, particularly the cavalry. He disengaged and decided to retreat back to Gaul to save the army for another time. However, his guides betrayed him. It is hard for me, as a modern-era soldier, to realize how difficult campaigning must have been in the absence of accurate maps. We take for granted now the ability to carry along various representations of the battlefield in our pockets, or, more often now, in computers that accompany us into battle. But well into the 19th century, there was very little accurate cartography available to generals. This is but one of the many factors that enables modern decentralized fighting. Hasdrubal had not been in Italy long, only months, and he found himself trapped against the Metaurus River and incapable of finding a spot to cross his army safely. Hannibal, far to the south, had been campaigning in the region for years. His familiarity with the ground would probably have spared him this particular threat. Here's an area where the ground services differ significantly from the air and sea services. It is, again, difficult to overstate the advantage home field gives to an army. In the American Civil War, much was said of Lee's tactical and operational brilliance, but this brilliance only seemed to work when fighting in his home state of Virginia. Once he crossed into Pennsylvania, bereft of local civilians guiding and informing him, he bumbled aimlessly into a fight he was poorly prepared for, and lost the war in his first and only away game at Gettysburg. Such was the case with Hasdrubal. Having fruitlessly marched for several hours nonstop, his troops were exhausted, but still pursued by the Romans. He had but little choice to draw up for battle. Worsening the situation, his Gallic levies had taken the opportunity to get drunk, for reasons known but to God, but I admit, kind of funny from my perspective. Hasdrubal drew up with the Metaurus River guarding his right flank and hills to his left. His weakness in cavalry forced him to guard his flanks jealously, fearing a flanking attack. As with nearly all Carthaginian forces, it was a mix of levies and mercenaries with very few actual African-based Carthaginians. Iberian and Gauls provided the bulk of his forces, with a tribe of northern Italian Celts, the Ligures, providing forces as well. His overall force was somewhere around 30,000, and facing him was an Italian force of approximately 40,000. Most trained Romans, with a few thousand local volunteers and approximately 2,000 cavalry. The Carthaginians were equipped with 10 elephants, whose unpredictable nature led Hasdrubal to provide the riders with hammers and chisels to kill the beasts should they attack their own lines. Marcus Livius was on the left of the Romans, Nero on the right, and the cavalry also on the left, facing what few cavalry the Carthaginians could provide. The Romans initiated the attack, using their superior cavalry to charge and break the Carthaginian right pinned against the banks of the Metaurus. The lines quickly broke. The center then moved against the Carthaginian center. The Gauls, facing the Roman right, proved too well entrenched into the hills and woods, and Nero, showing a tactical brilliance to match his operational, detached his legions who swept behind the battling front lines to reinforce the success on the left and leaving the Roman right almost undefended. Yet again, an audacious and risky move that proved correct. The hungover Gauls, situated safely in the hills, either missed this weakness or were too preoccupied with being safe, saw it, and determined to not attack. Such is the risk with mercenaries. You can't get paid if you get killed. The mass of Romans on the Carthaginian right, having routed the Hispanic Iberians, now the center began to break. The fleeing Carthaginian forces on the right and center allowed the Gauls to be attacked from front, flank, and rear. Over half of the elephants were killed by their own drivers, with the remainder captured by the Romans. Hasdrubal himself fought everywhere, attempting to salvage a victory, but, ultimately seeing the fruitless nature of his attempts, gathered what Hispanics he could and charged at the heart of the Roman army and died gallantly in defeat. The Roman pursuit was poor, indeed. One of the Carthaginian generals who survived, Hamilcar, retreated into Gaul and raised a force of 40,000 and reinvaded Rome with some success before ultimately being defeated and killed at the Battle of Cremona 7 years later. An estimated 10,000 Carthaginians eventually joined Hannibal to the south, but this was never enough, and his force was finally defeated, having retreated to Africa in the Battle of Zama against Scipio Africanus in 2002. The peace treaty was severe. Carthage was stripped of all possessions and colonies, even some of those in Africa. Their military forces were limited, and express permission from Rome was required for any military action. Naturally, a large indemnity was expected to be paid, a nearly impossible sum for such a neutered entity. But for Rome, this wasn't enough. Numidian attacks against remaining Carthaginian holdings in Africa in 151 BC caused Carthage to raise an army for defense, and Rome took this as a violation and landed a force in Tunisia in 149. The Carthaginians surrendered all weapons, but this wasn't enough. Only the incompetence of the Roman leadership let the Third Punic War go on as long as it did. A siege was laid against Carthage, which fell in 146, with hundreds of thousands killed and 50,000 enslaved. The city itself was destroyed, and a Roman city built on the ruins a century later. The city lasted until the 14th century, when Muslims destroyed it totally yet again. Its ruins lay unknown until the early 20th century, and thus is the story of Carthage and the Punic Wars in general. So why was Metaurus so decisive? Like most of these great stories, these battles only mark the beginnings of the end of great empires or the end of the beginning of newer, greater empires, and sometimes both. So with Marathon was the rise of Athens. Syracuse was the beginning of the end of the same. Gaugamela was the end of the Achaemenid Persians and the rise of the Hellenic Empire. And here was the end of the Phoenicians. Carthage was their last great city, and the transition of the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. The battle itself is noteworthy for Gaius Claudius Nero's decisive actions, both in battle and in operational maneuver, seizing boldly the opportunities presented and moving unordered to the right place at the right time. The Roman name of Nero would be marred by a later emperor sharing the same name, but the earlier Nero deserves to be remembered much more fondly and his actions recorded for future reference. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.